your connection looks like.
Okay. And we'll allow people on as they come in. So thank you again for joining us this morning for our adjunct faculty live seminars. This morning we have Mr. Tim Nolan joining us. Mr. Nolan is going to be talking about economics and the principle of resource scarcity, which is a very relevant topic today. Mr. Nolan was a former CIA intelligence officer and a UN development economist. So thank you very much, Mr. Nolan, for joining us today, and we'll go ahead and get started.
All set?
All set.
Hey out there, good morning. Yeah, I'm Tim Nolan. As Suzanne explained, I'm going to be talking a little bit different than maybe what you were expecting or what you've been hearing in the past. I've had different kinds of jobs, but one thing I have done for a long time is teach economics from high school all up to graduate classes. So I thought it'd be fun to actually gear this little short presentation to you students out there. So if you're there, hope you're there. My goal is to introduce you, or if you've already heard a little bit about economics, to talk about some more about it. Introduce you to it if you haven't heard about it much, and try to get you turned on to maybe even taking a class in your college career at some point. It's one of my favorite areas. I've loved it all my life, so I hope you enjoy it. If you end up going that direction. I've taught so many classes. Oftentimes, I ask students, why are you here in this class? And oftentimes they say, well, I have to be here. And so that's kind of a letdown, I have to admit. But I try to find a few people who are saying, well, I really want to learn something about economics. I'm not just here because I have to take it. So what we're going to do today is go through just a little bit about what economics is about, introduce you to the subject. Then I want to spend a little bit of time talking about scarcity, which is the major principle, or one of the major principles of economics. And then at the end, if you have questions, I'll try to finish up. I have a tendency to talk too much, so if we end up with a little bit of time, we can have some questions, so you can write them down, but hold on to your questions until the end. I got besides looking at economics, I got another motive in mind here, and it's something that is even bigger than economics. Yeah, this pandemic and economics in the news and everything, there's no shortage of opinions. People have got an opinion about everything. But I'll tell you something very frankly, to my way, opinions are kind of cheap sometimes because they're just opinions. They aren't based on facts and based on theory. And so that's what I'd like you to consider. Besides listening a little bit to economics, I'd like you to consider trying to move beyond opinions and into knowledge, because that's really what it's about. It's more than just opinions. It's knowing what you talk about and knowing that you're pretty solid in what you're talking about. So that's where I come from, and that's where I hope you'll take a look at also. I got a little chip on my shoulder too, because there's a lot of jokes about economists and economics. So that's the butt of a lot of jokes. If you go on the internet and if you look at jokes, you look at economist jokes or economics jokes, you can go on for days, hours at least, looking at all the jokes that people have about us econ folks. So I'm going to be up front and I'm going to take a couple minutes and talk about some jokes. So at least you know that I have a view of it as humorously as perhaps others do. So I picked out a few jokes here that are one-liners. Thought we could just listen into these. So here's one of them. I got six of them actually, short. Number one, what happens when you put 10 economists in a room? The answer is you get 11 opinions. Okay, I can agree with that. Next one is economics is the only field in which two people can get a Nobel Prize for saying the opposite thing. Yeah, that's probably true as well. Here's another one. An economist's left leg is on fire and his right leg is frozen. And he says in response to that, on average, I'm perfectly fine. So I thought that was pretty good. Another one, if all economists in the world were laid end to end, they would not reach a conclusion. I've heard that one many times, so it's been around. Okay, I get it. Another one, economists have predicted 6 of the last 2 recessions. Okay, because there's a lot of questions about what's a recession. And then finally, economists can't make you a millionaire, but it can keep you out of the poorhouse. But it can't help you understand how you got to either of those places. So, all right. So we had our jokes, and that's the funny side of it. Okay, so just to introduce you, again, maybe some of you have even know something about economics, and maybe some of you don't, but I'm going to assume that you don't really have a lot of knowledge about it. So I'm going to introduce you to it. The first time that I ever ran into the subject, I was reading through some Greek history, and there it was, the Greek word economia, meaning household economics. So back in BC or BCE times, in the Greek literature, the Greeks viewed economics as being solely having to do with household matters. It wasn't until really 1776, our revolution, by the way, that Adam Smith came along and talked about the wealth of nations. First time that actually we talked about wealth of nations was into the nature and causes of economic activity. So what really is economics? I mean, it's primarily a social science, believe it or not. If you've studied social sciences, these are studies about human beings. And humans have different quirks and characteristics to them. So here's an example of social sciences. One is psychology. It's about people, how they think. Sociology, how they interact. Geography, where they live and go. Anthropology, where they came from. And of course, economics, how they take scarce resources and use them for satisfying unlimited wants and needs. So economics, even though it's become highly mathematical in the last 50 years, is still primarily a social science. And that's the way I like to look at it, because it really is looking at humans and kind of figuring out how they behave and trying to develop theories about that. So what does economics deal with? It deals with production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. And I like to put that in terms of 3 different statements. It's the what, which would be the use of resources, the how, which is the production of resources into products, and the for whom, which is you and I and others who consume those resources into goods and services. Inevitably, the way that question is asked, the what, the how, and the for whom, okay, the production, distribution, and consumption all end up having to do with economic systems. And there are 4 economic systems that I can think about right now. I give you these 4 right now. Well, one of them is traditional And I was looking up for examples of traditional economies. These are ones that rely heavily upon natural resources like agriculture, fishing. The closest example I came to that was Haiti, which, if you look into the economy of Haiti, poorest country in Western Hemisphere, um, traditional, a lot of small farms, some aquaculture going on, but the fact that it's a poor country has a lot to do with it. It's a fact that it's still a traditional economy. Next one is free market. Again, there are not many free market economies. We here in the U.S. like to think we're actually a free market, but we're not. We're coming up next on that. But I looked for an example of free market, and I found about the closest approximation is Hong Kong, where the role of government is pretty limited. There's freedom to produce and sell basically whatever. Hong Kong relies heavily upon trade, imports and exports. So again, having a small city-state like Hong Kong contributes to the fact that it actually can end up as a free market. And there are not too many of those. That's probably about the only one. Maybe Singapore, but those are the closest two that I know of in this world. Next one is a command economy, where it's just the opposite from free market. Basically, a government or government institution or a group of people or a person controls all the resources and dictates how those resources are going to be used. And I think the closest approximation to that is probably North Korea. And we know about how their economy operates. Centrally planned, centrally distributed, and very limited consumption. And finally, which, believe it or not, is the most common one, is an economic system called mixed, which is a bunch of all of them except traditional, but it combines elements of free market and command. So the US is a mixed economy. We have elements of free markets, but we have a lot of government involvement in our economy through legislation and regulations and so forth. Other economies include Sweden, UK, India, Russia, France, Iceland, China to some extent. So all these countries are basically mixed economies. And so to go back to what I said earlier, the questions of what to produce, how to produce it, how to distribute it, and who uses it are usually answered with these three kind of systems, either traditional, free market, command, or mixed. So when we look at economics, we have to figure out how it works as a social science. And every social science that I know anything about is based on data. So the typical thing is you collect a bunch of data and you analyze the data and you figure out that that data can be summarized into what's called a theory. So a theory is a simplification of a bunch of data about how people behave. So in economics, if you study, for instance, a bunch of people and you interview them and you say, what do you consume? Get a list of everything you consume for the next month. And I'll come back, and after a month, I'll collect all that data and I'll put it together and I'll come up with some ideas about all these different people that I asked to do this work. And so I go back and I collect all that stuff. And sure enough, I reach some conclusions, you know, out of the 50 people that were involved in this thing, I collect data and they all tend to buy a certain kinds of food. So if that's the universe I'm dealing with, these 50 people, I can say, you know, actually, I can conclude based on the my universe of these 50 people that they consume X amount of meat or Y amount of bread. And they spend this amount on that product and this amount on other products. and I reach what's called a theory about consumption patterns. Okay, so which is what economists do. They theorize. You know, there's 330 million people in the U.S. That's a lot of people. So they end up theorizing about how consumers behave. Do they get it right? Well, for the most part, they try, but trying to deal with 330 million people is tough at best. So you have to come up with some explanation, some way of looking at how they end up consuming, and you form that into what's called a theory. And then the next thing with the theory is, what do you do with it? Well, it's applied. Okay, so let's take an example of that. If everybody is eating a certain amount of meat, they like beef or they like lamb, and then that's information for producers that they want to know, how can I apply this information, and how can I end up using this? And maybe they change their production of livestock around based on the idea that people prefer more pork than lamb, or more beef than lamb, or more hot dogs than hamburgers, or more rib roast to steaks, and on and on and on. So there's an application out of that. And as you listen to Mr. Rushford, Greg Rushford, for the last couple of weeks, you see how that gets put through into trade policies as well. So we tell our trading partners, you know, we need more of this, or we need more of that, based on, again, start with data, move to a theory, develop the theory into an application, and act on it. And maybe, again, a year or two later, you got to do the whole exercise all over again, because consumption patterns change a lot over time. So economists spend their life trying to figure out how all this works. Again, coming back to human behavior. I wanted to jump into a little bit about scarcity now. Here's the thing, folks. Scarcity. I tried to figure out how to get into this, and then I decided, let's try something as a game. All right. So here's my game. I'm going to pretend all these students out there in class are actually in the building. We're not having any COVID virus stuff anymore. And so we're all in the same classroom. And let's say there's 25 of you, all right? So you walk into the classroom, and the first thing you notice about the classroom is there's only 10 chairs, 10 desks. And so you look at me, and I'm the teacher, and you say, well, wait a minute, I don't have a desk. And so I say, well, you do, but I want you to figure out how you're going to get a desk. So we got 25 of you and 10 desks. There's a shortage of desks. So I want you to figure out how to do that. So I say, come back, I'll come back in an hour and give me your ideas on how to do this. So you do, you come back after half an hour and you say, well, okay, we got some ideas. So here's one idea. How about we do it on the basis of age? So I say, okay, fine. So you seniors and juniors, you know, you're in luck because you got a desk, you know, then we'll go down. Sorry, freshmen and sophomores in high school, you know, you don't fit that. So you're gonna have to stand, but you're younger, so you can go ahead and stand. Or somebody says, well, let's do a lottery. Let's put the 10 desks, number them 1 to 10, put them in a hat, and let's pick a number. If you happen to get one of the 10, you get a desk. The others, sorry, you got to stand. That's okay too. So maybe you come up with just who arrives first. That's it. If you get here if you're the earliest at class, you get a desk. If you're not there, too bad, you lose. And so I say, okay, fine. Those are all great examples. What about this example? How about we have an auction? let's have an auction for these chairs. And I'm going to be the auctioneer, and I'm going to start out with $10. And so, like an auctioneer, I go, I got $10. Anybody give me $10? $10. And everybody, all you 25 go, yeah, I can do that. I've got $10. So you all say yes. And then I say, okay, well, everybody's in the game. So give me $30. Give me $30. Anybody got that? And sure enough, a couple of you say, ew, I can't do that. I don't have the $30. So I'm going to have to drop out. So we go from 25 down to 23 or 22, something like that. So then again, I go, all right, give me $40 out there. And a bunch of you drop out then and say, I think I'll stand. It's not worth it. It's too expensive. And we keep doing this and doing this. And finally, I get up to a point where, guess what? Price has allocated the scarce resource called chairs, desks. So that's an example of a commodity, but it's an important point because in a system we have, price does something very magical. It dictates how resources are going to be used because price then allocates those resources to their highest and best use. So let's go now backwards. We'll get out of the situation of desks and look at our resources. So basically, the principle of scarcity says we've got a shortage of supply of resources and an unlimited supply of needs or wants for those resources. So let's say, take the simplest resource, a tree, and that tree could have many, many uses. It could sit there and be used as a piece of historical memorabilia where this tree has been around for 1,000 years, and so let's take a look at it and just leave it there as a museum piece. You come and visit and say, isn't that a wonderful tree? That tree could also be used as a house. It could be also used as furniture. It could also be used as paper product, and so on and so on and so on. So you can take scarce resources like natural resources, which are the most obvious thing to start with, and say, hey, let's try to figure out how best to use those resources. So I'm going to give you the resources that economists look at all the time. Excuse me, I got to grab a drink of water. Like I said, I do a lot of talking. So here's the list of resources. First resource is land. Now that land is a term that includes water, by the way. So it means basically all natural resources that are on this earth. I can't speak about space so much, but I can talk about air being a resource, land being a resource, the sea being a resource. You get the idea. The next resource is labor. So labor is a resource. When you enter the workforce and begin your work career, maybe some of you have part-time jobs or something, I'm not sure, but maybe you are. You actually are a labor resource. That includes anybody who's working. Anybody who gets paid money for the use of their labor, they're considered to be part of the labor force. And by the way, everybody's not to digress here a moment, but everybody's interested now in the economy because guess what? We've got a lot of unemployment. You know, we're above almost to 15% officially, but frankly, in my opinion, we're probably closer to 25%, which is unbelievable historically. So anyway, we'll talk more about labor in a minute. Third resource is called capital. This is tricky, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the term capital, but if you ever do take an econ class, you'll learn more about capital as a resource. The closest approximation I'm going to say to capital is machinery. It makes production more efficient. So if you think of capital as machines, let's take a look at a simple farm. Okay, we have a farmer, and we have land that the farmer works on, and then the farmer buys a tractor. Well, there's a capital good right there. that allows the farmer to produce more efficiently on that given piece of land. So we have land, labor, capital, and finally, we have a term, again, called, that's a little bit tricky to deal with. It's called entrepreneurship, or what we call risk taking. There are certain resources, there are certain people in this world who are risk takers, who are willing to invest in businesses, and these people have an ownership stake, either as sole proprietor or as part of corporation ownership through stocks. But basically, they end up being referred to as a resource as well. So we've got four resources: land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. So I want to focus just really on land and labor right now, because the other two are a little bit complicated, and the lesson is clear from just land and labor. It has to do again with a farmer. So there's a piece of land out there. It looks great, and but what are you going to do with the land? You got to do something with it. The land isn't going to grow itself. So you get yourself a farmer comes along and goes, hey, let's I think I can do something with that land. But I don't have, all I got are my bare hands here. What am I going to do? How am I going to deal with this land? I want to plant crops, but I can't just dig holes with my fingers. So farmer somehow acquires an implement, farm implement, call it a shovel, call it a pick or whatever. So the farmer is now able to farm. And so the production process, so the resources are land and labor. So that's the scarce resource. The production occurs, the land is then producing something, and the product it consumes are potatoes or tomatoes or something like that, and that's the product that's consumed. So that's the simplest example of how our resources are used. But what I'm trying to get at is that these scarce resources force us into choosing. And choosing is something that's rather interesting, because as consumers, we can choose a lot. But the act of choosing how to use resources is a critical decision, obviously. So in a free market, the basis of how we choose oftentimes is what we can afford. And again, so price enters in. Price enters in by helping us make the decision for us. So going back to the issue of you 25 students and those 10 desks, the price made the choice for some of you. So 15 of you got out and said, I think I'll stand. So it's not worth it to spend $50, $60 for a desk. So I can use that. So, that's where price and choice come in and are inextricably linked. Let's give some examples of scarcity. I just ran into a few right here. So I'm just going to read off some examples of resources that are in scarce supply, used to meet human unlimited needs and wants. First one, overfishing, which can result in a scarcity of a type of fish. Coal is used to create energy. The limited amount of this resource that can be mined is an example of scarcity. Overhunting of animal populations that make it scarce. Refusal of pharmaceutical companies to create drugs that don't make large profits can cause medication of certain types to be scarce. That's a critical one right now. Each year, a limited amount of flu vaccine is available to the population, meaning there is not enough for each individual to be vaccinated. Trust me on this, folks. We're going to go through this issue when we get a vaccine for coronavirus. The flooding in Nigeria washed away farmlands that have the potential to create a scarcity of food for the residents of Nigeria. An undereducated population in a country that needs high levels of skilled labor can result in a scarcity of labor. That's how I, incidentally, always viewed education. I said to myself, the more education you have, the scarcer you become. The scarcer you become, the more valuable you become, the higher wage you get for that scarcity. That doesn't work out in every case, but I think in a lot of cases it does. So get as much education as you can. It will pay off, believe me. A disenfranchised population may not volunteer for military services, resulting in scarcity of individuals who recruit for the armed services. Recent proposed gun legislation in the United States has caused individuals to hoard ammunition, leaving a scarcity of ammunition. Waste of water through long showers or allowing water to run while brushing your teeth can contribute to a scarcity of water. I spent many years in the Middle East where, water is a very scarce resource, extremely scarce resource. And you think carefully about how water is used when you live in an area that's prone to drought. So I hope you got the idea about resources being scarce, and I hope that you can see as yourself as consumers, you have a choice. You have a choice in determining how those resources are used. How is your choice manifested? Well, it's manifested in how you spend your money, and the system revolves around production. Things are produced that consumers want. How are they distributed? They're distributed through various ways, companies, warehouses, so forth. And finally, how are they distributed? Who gets them? Well, in a fairly free market economy like we have here in the U.S., it's distributed on the basis of price. There's one other concept I want to introduce besides scarcity that is actually, I wasn't thinking about this initially when I was asked to give this talk, but then it occurred to me, this is kind of important, actually. It's the concept of opportunity cost. For those of you that are not in classes right now, maybe you had an econ class years ago, and so you know what opportunity costs are all about. But opportunity cost is a unique way of looking at what something costs. So I'm looking at what here right now. I'm looking at this. This is some paper. This paper pad. Okay. I'm thinking, okay, this paper pad. What's this paper pad cost? Well, let's just say it costs $1. Well, that's how we typically looking at the paper cost and saying, yeah. I go to a store and I say it costs $1 and you pay the dollar and you got the thing. But I'm going to propose an alternative way of looking at the cost of this pad. I'm going to propose that the cost of this pad is not $1. It's how resources could have been used for something else besides a pad. So let's say instead of this pad of paper, it's got 100 pages or so here, if you can see me flipping through them. Instead of 100 pages of paper here, this was used for, say, some kind of packaging material, okay? So it's paper, so it could have been used for packaging. And let's say there's enough paper in here to provide packaging for 10 packages.
Zoom right now.
And so actually the cost of this, I'm not showing it right there, the cost of this pad of paper is not $1, it's actually 10 packages worth of paper. So I want you to think about resources as having an opportunity cost, and that is we as consumers choose how resources are used, and that ultimately, once those resources are used the way consumers want them or decide they are going to be used, guess what? Those resources can't be used for anything else. And that's the opportunity cost. It has to do with alternative uses. So resources, when looked in this in the way of having alternative uses, then we know that definitely the alternative cost idea, or what's called opportunity cost in economics, has a lot to do with what the actual dollar value is. So the way we express things as cost is in terms of dollars. That's the currency we use. But I'd like you to consider the idea that resources are in fact being used and have alternative uses. Instead of saying this pad of paper is $1, I'd like you to consider thinking that this pad of paper is actually cost 5 packages that could have been prepared instead of using it for paper. So I think that's about it. I got just to I'm getting close to what I was hoping to do would be to run out to about now, 35 minutes. So we've covered what economics is. We looked at scarcity of resources, went through the different kinds of resources, and ended up looking at opportunity costs. So I think that's, you know, I've taught a lot of econ classes, but this is the most unusual one because I'm trying to cover a lot in a very short amount of time. So I hope that, if anything, a couple of you, as I said at the very beginning, I asked students, well, why are you in econ class? And they say, well, I have to be. And so I hope that you're not in that situation. Maybe there's 2 or 3 of you or so who are going to say, you know, this kind of gets my interest. I'm going to take an econ class, and I hope you end up doing it. I think, like me, I found it. I found my love in econ, so hope you do too. Any questions? So go ahead.
Anybody have
I'm
any
all
questions?
ears.
Anybody have any questions for Mr. Nolan this morning?
I have a question. Tim Nolan, this is Nikki Brady. Just curious about your opinion. Do you think that we are well balanced between a mixed and a free, I just lost the word, free market?
Free market.
Do you like
Well,
pendulum stands?
you can probably talk to 100 different people and they'll give you 100 different answers as to whether it's balanced or not. I mean, that's the great political debate. The great political debate we're having right now. I mean, we've been through this debate for the last 4 or 5 years intensely. Is about the role of government, the role of private sector. I mean, it's a very difficult question because everybody is going to have a different answer.
I put you on the spot.
It gets into the role of opinion again, and I shy away from opinion because I try to see things from a standpoint of knowledge or what economists would say about this. And I don't think that anybody would dare say that the mix is right, because right is not, it means different things to different people. Let's put it this way.
Sure.
We have been able to successfully navigate our country through 250 years or so, and I guess that's testimony to the fact that we've done a pretty decent job. We muddled through a lot of it. We made a lot of dumb mistakes along the way, but we're still all together. So I think if we take it from a historical perspective, we probably are doing it the right way.
All right. I was just curious what you would say. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Nolan this morning?
Tim, I have a.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Sorry, I'll go after.
Tim, thank you for your presentation this morning. It's a great introduction to economics. My question is that, you know, over the last, I don't know, 30, 50 years, most economics has become very quantitative and mathematical. So that if you read much about microeconomics or developmental economics, you have to have a pretty sophisticated understanding of mathematics to get any headway. But economics can also be appreciated and understood in a more generalist way of, based, along the lines of your talk this morning, how markets work, and, more widely non-mathematical vocabulary. And I wonder if for our students or our audience today, you might have any books to recommend that would be more along that generalist understanding of how economics or economic concepts can work.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks. First of all, you're right. Okay, I've taught graduate classes in economics, and I have to know some calculus to get through those classes because they're very quantitative, and that's just the nature of way the social science, which was originally, has become heavily mathematical. I'm beginning to sense a gradual shift back to what it was originally, which is more of a social science aspect and more looking at human beings instead of not just as models. The book that comes to mind is The Worldly Philosophers by Heilbronner. I like that book, and I read it long time ago. It takes economics from a historical perspective and goes through it and looks at economists from Adam Smith on up into Keynes and so forth, and looks at their contributions historically. And it's very easy to read book, and it puts economics in the historical context and also emphasizes it as a social science. So I would recommend that one. It's pretty easy reading too. It's a good book.
Could you repeat the name, the author?
Class, I'd probably say if I were to do an econ class for again, I would probably recommend Heilbronner as a textbook. Actually, it's a good book. Okay, thanks for the question.
So I was curious, when currently, as you were talking about, like we have a really high demand of resources and there's becoming a real lack of it due to current circumstances, what do you think are, from like historical examples of this, what do you think are like long-term impacts of having such a drain on resources, or not just like high demand, that then like what is the, like, how does it change then? What is the flip point of that?
Yeah, we got to watch out because those resources are limited. It's just a population issue primarily because we've got 7.5 billion people, and we've got poor countries that don't want to stay poor. They want to get rich, like the U.S. They want to get developed, and as they get developed, they put further drains on the resource stock that we have, and so we have to make. I mean, it was great when there were few people living on Earth and all these resources were available. You could pick and choose, but we do have a definite scarcity of resources. And as I say, when you view resources as an opportunity cost, think in those terms. If you've got every additional person that joins and wants to be developed in the sense of having a higher living standard, every time that happens, then you have to begin to think in terms of alternative uses of a resource. It could go this way, it could go that way, and it's no longer right, in my view, to simply deal with resources in terms of their price. I mean, that's all we deal with all the time. Is it costs $1, it costs $100, it costs whatever. I think we need to think more in terms of what are we giving up to get the good that we want. I mean, we as a world society have got to think about that because of just demographics. The world is growing. There's more demand, and as those demands go up, science is limited insofar as what they're capable of offering beyond the limited stock of resources. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you very much.
Welcome. Thank you.
That was a great question, Hannah.
Yeah, it was.
Great. Any other questions for Mr. Nolan this morning? Well, Mr. Nolan, I have to tell you, we're all very grateful that you were able to be with us here today. And actually, already my mind's spinning about how else we might be able to entice you to come help our students learn a little bit more about this in the future months.
Well, so that'll be an easy question to answer. I enjoy it.
That's so awesome. Yeah. Well, we're very grateful. And I thank all of you who have attended today. High school seniors, good luck with your AP exams this week. I know you don't need any luck. You're well prepared, but every little bit helps. And I will look forward to seeing all of you and more next week. Next Tuesday morning, we're going to have Mr. Rushford finish his 3-part series on economics. And then shortly after Mr. Rushford finishes at 10:45, we'll have Chuck Ockrey, who is the CEO and CIO of Ockrey Capital Management. He's got over $14 billion under management, and he's going to talk about what we do with all of our extra money. So I'm looking forward to hearing that. And again, thank you so much, Mr. Nolan. We'll look forward to seeing you hopefully very soon.
Good luck to everybody out there in their tests.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nolan.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Paul, good to see you.